Hello, I'm Tanara Renard-Triong. I am the coordinator of the IPBES Thematic Assessment Report on Invasive Alien Species and Their Control, which was recently approved at the 10th session of the plenary of the IPBES member states. Today, I'm going to take you through some steps of the process and tell you a bit about what happens behind the scenes. First, a few words about IPBES assessments. What are we talking about? An assessment is a critical evaluation of the state of knowledge, which means that we do not produce new knowledge. It is done by a multidisciplinary group of selected experts, and they interact with governments and peers. This is all done in a sequential process to ensure legitimacy, relevance, and credibility. The assessment is problem-driven. It outlines policy options for decision makers. And the main difference with a literature review is that a summary for policymakers and the chapter's executive summaries include confidence terms. They indicate the assessment of the experts in every statement of those documents. It goes from well-established to inconclusive based on the quantity and quality of the evidence and the level of agreement. Assessments are usually composed of four main parts. You have the front matter, the summary for policymakers, which includes all the key messages and summarizes all the chapters. We have chapters and the back matter. All IPBES assessments are guided by a scoping report, which has been approved by IPBES member states. The IPBES assessment scoping report outlines the objectives, the guiding questions, the structure, and also give information on the size of the expert group and feasibility. Focusing on the IPBES-IS assessment, how was the assessment produced? Well, this is just to show you that most of you only hear about assessments once they're launched, but there's a big history, a long history for every of the assessments. For instance, for the case of the invasive alien species assessment, this idea was first brought up in IPBES 2 in 2014. It was launched in IPBES 7 in 2019 and only released and publicly available from IPBES 10 in 2023. And here we are. After 4 years of the development, we have 6 chapters, a summary for policymakers, and a glossary. This was very much the result of a group effort. We had an amazing team of 86 nominated experts from 47 countries, encompassing all regions and many disciplines. To help this team, we also had the support from 200 contributing authors, which provided some inputs on some sections and text and data. These experts were supported by a management committee composed of members of the IPBES Multidisciplinary Experts Panel and the Bureau, and a technical support unit based in Japan. I was part of this technical support unit. We also collaborated with all the IPBES task forces on knowledge and data, indigenous and local knowledge, scenarios and models, policy support tools, and capacity building to help us produce an assessment with the highest quality standard. Now focusing a little bit on the expert selection. Any individual that is qualified and interested can apply to participate to an assessment as an expert. They would need to be nominated by their government or their organization. Once we have gathered this nominated pool of experts, we had 260 for the invasive alien species assessment. The MEP, the Multidisciplinary Expert Panel, will select the appropriate number of experts. This sounds simple, but there's a full set of criteria that the MEP has to ensure and to respect when selecting the experts. For instance, it has to be careful about the disciplines that are needed for this specific assessment, but also the gender balance, the regional balance, and because IPBES is an intergovernmental process, at least 80% of the selected experts have to be nominated by governments. We then invite all these experts, and throughout the process, there's always an opportunity. There's a process that we can follow to fill the gaps in case we have some. There are different roles in the expert group. But it is important to note that all experts dedicate their time voluntarily. They all do this on a voluntary basis, which is really amazing. We have in the IS assessment 3 co-chairs. They oversaw the preparation of the assessments and they ensured that the report was completed on time and to the highest scientific standard. They dedicated about 30% of their time. We also had about 3 coordinating lead authors per chapters who are tasked with coordinating their chapter team and also address cross-cutting issues, ensuring that their chapter was completing on time and to the highest scientific standard. Lead authors and fellows being early career scientists selected through the fellowship program of IPBES, were responsible for sections of the chapters. They were basically synthesizing the evidence to the highest scientific standard, and they were expected to dedicate about 10 to 15% of their time. Finally, we had 2 review editors per chapter, and they were not involved in the writing, but they advised on controversial issues and ensured that review comments received through the assessment process, that I will detail a bit later, are dealt with fairly. As I said before, we had the support from about 200 contributing authors that provided specific text, figures, or data to fill the gaps in chapters. They did not have access to the chapters because the entire assessment process is confidential, but they are, of course, acknowledged in the final report. This is the timeline of the assessment. As I said before, this is done in a sequential process. We had 3 major phases. The first one being the development of the first draft of the chapters. The second phase was the development of the second draft of the chapters and the first draft of the summary for policymakers. And the last phase was the development of the final chapters and summary for policymakers. Each of these phases included an author meeting, a meeting with indigenous and local knowledge participants, and an external review. Talking about meetings, we had countless online meetings. We had weekly co-chairs meetings, chapter meetings, cross-cutting theme meetings, management committee meetings, a lot of meetings through which we developed the assessments. But we only had 3 in-person author meetings over 4 years. And actually, because of COVID, we only had 1.5. But those meetings are very important. They are participated by all the experts, from the co-chairs, coordinating lead authors, fellows, and of course, review editors. They really set out directions for the next year. That is where the experts discuss, address, and reply to external review comments. Of course, this is the perfect opportunity to address cross-cutting issues and improve the cross-chapter consistency. As mentioned before, we had 3 ILK, indigenous and local knowledge dialogue meetings to help us integrate more of this knowledge within the assessment. How was the evidence assessed? There were a lot of systematic literature reviews. Over 13,000 documents were reviewed in depth, but of course, many more were screened. For instance, for a single literature review on scenarios and models, about 30,000 documents were screened. And by documents, we mean academic and gray literature, meaning ILK materials and government reports, for instance. This really ensured that diverse values and knowledge systems were included in the assessment. As explained before, we had experts' assessments using confidence terms, and everything was documented in data management reports very transparently, following the IPBES data management policy. All IPBES assessments are guided by the IPBES conceptual framework. And if you're interested to see how we have adapted it to the needs of the invasive alien species assessment, you are very welcome to download Chapter 1 and learn more about it. We had 3 external reviews, during which we have received over 10,000 comments. Those external reviews are the only time where the assessment is publicly available to any registered reviewer. And they're critical in ensuring the scientific quality, the credibility, and the policy relevance of the assessment. It really also helps to ensure consistency. For instance, we have received many suggestions on additional literature and additional themes that had not been treated, and that really improved the assessment. The external reviews happened for the first auto draft of the chapters, for the second auto draft of the chapters, and the first auto draft of the summary for policymakers. And we also had an additional government review for the summary for policymakers. Reviewers can be any interested and qualified experts that include scientists, decision makers, practitioners, or other knowledge holders, and also governments. They are, of course, acknowledged in the report for their huge contributions to the process. We also had many internal reviews among the expert group. But please check the IPBES website for more information on any ongoing external reviews and see if you can participate to the process. The final step of the assessment is the plenary approval. The IPBES 10 took place from the 28th of August until the 2nd of September 2023. And IPBES member states were invited to adopt the summary for policymakers of the assessment and accept the chapters of the assessment. That means that only the summary for policymakers was negotiated. We actually had a final government review 6 weeks prior to plenary, and the experts gathered for a week to address and include all those comments into what we call the chair's note, which is the final document, an edited version of the summary for policymakers that is usually used as a basis for negotiations. We had more than 35 hours of negotiations in plenary over 4 days, where IPBES experts responded to member states' questions. This was really a co-construction and co-ownership process of the assessment. The assessment was launched on the 4th of September 2023. And I am going to very quickly go through the expected impacts of the reports and the preliminary impacts of the reports. What's special about this assessment is that it's the first assessment on this theme, comprehensive and global report on invasive alien species and their control. It provides the best available evidence for anyone who seeks to address the issue of biological invasions. Of course, it comes within an international context and will really help to achieve the target 6 of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and also support the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, especially Goal 15, but not only. It will support sharing of information within and across countries, but it will also support capacity building globally, especially in developing countries. And you can see here, we have developed a few fact sheets that are targeted to some sectors and some actors that are very useful to communicate on the assessment. The invasive alien species will contribute to raising awareness on biological invasions, and this is a compilation of some of the major outlets that have reported on the launch of the assessment. We were very pleased with the outcomes and the media outreach in about 50 languages in over 100 countries. Here are some of the preliminary uptakes and impacts of the assessment. It is very early in the process, of course, but we've been very pleased to see the uptake that have been taking place. We had a few communication on the issue of biological invasions with the revision of a national communication strategy to align with the language from the assessment. We also had many official communications from countries such as Chile and France, but also translation of the summary for policymakers that is in progress to facilitate the uptake of the assessment in some countries. We had many presentations and events organized by Japan, the UK, Finland, France, Norway, and many others. But also our presence in policy fora. We participated to the CEPSAS 25 from the CBD and to the G7 workshop on invasive alien species, where a statement on invasive alien species from the member states committing to address this issue together and with other countries has been issued. There's been an action from a science network. A new GBEF task group will address the need for improved access to better data and information on invasive alien species, which is a direct response to one of the options outlined in the report, and also action from the private sector. There's been funding opportunities with the government of South Australia releasing funds to control the buffalo grass, an invasive alien species in this area. All the impacts can be registered at ipbes.net/impacts tracking. Thank you very much.